Hi, this is Suzette West, and I would like to welcome you to the debut episode of the Wild Orchid Capital Podcast, where we are on a mission to bring value and information to investors. And with me today is Al Schmidt and his team from Source Advisors. The Source Advisors team are cost segregation and tax credit specialists. They are experts on the subject of bonus depreciation and tax credits that can be used to shelter income under certain conditions. So at this point, I would like to turn things over to Al so he can introduce himself, his team, and share with us more about cost segregation, bonus depreciation, and why these two things are so important for investors to know. So with that, I am pleased to introduce to you Al Schmidt and the Source Advisors team.
Thanks, Suzette. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today. We'll certainly cover a number of things here. I know there's a lot to talk about, so the agenda for today is to really give you an overview of cost segregation, an intro to cost segregation. Cost segregation can be really pretty technical, so we will do everything that we can to keep it at a high level. Bonus depreciation is another thing that we'll review. Bonus depreciation has been around for quite some time, but under the recent tax changes in late 2017, early 2018, bonus depreciation became even more beneficial. There's the next couple of things, Section 179, tangible property, exit strategies, and some other issues are all things that are worth mentioning. They're great topics. They might be a little bit more for folks that own their own real estate themselves, as opposed to owning it in a fund. But we'll touch on those so that folks can be aware of that, and then we'll close it out from there. So Charles Duncan is our cost segregation technical director. He's got over 25 years experience in the industry. And he's actually covered or he's managed multiple national practices. He's been with Big Four multiple times, so he's got quite a bit of experience. He's done thousands of studies and reviews or been involved with them, and he really is a thought leader in the industry. He does a tremendous amount of continuing education for many of our clients being CPA firms, and continues to run our practice and grow the practice as well. And Brian Coddington, he is a technical resource. He's actually soon to be coming back to us, which is great. But he gets involved in a lot of the specialty areas where we need a lot of research and information. So he'll do a lot of the research around inventory, cost segregation, other tax credits and incentives as well. And we're happy to have him back, and looking forward to being able to grow the practice with him as well. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Charles and Brian from here, and they can take it from there and go through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Al.
Thank you, Al.
So we're going to start out with an introduction to cost segregation. And if you've never heard of cost segregation, that's okay. If you have, that's even better. Cost segregation is a tax savings strategy that's been around for decades. It's changed names many times, but the basic principles have remained the same, though the particular levers used to get to the end results may have changed. But before diving into what is cost segregation, I want to ask you a question. How would you like an interest-free loan from the government? So, Charles, can you tell us a little more about the background of cost segregation?
Sure. I'd love to, Brian. So cost segregation evolved from the old investment tax credit. In theory, we can perform a cost segregation on any building that's been placed in service since about 1987, although in reality, we're looking at buildings that have been constructed or acquired much more recently than that. The reason is that with cost segregation, what we're doing is we're front loading the depreciation expense deduction that a building would already qualify for. But instead of spreading it out over the life of the property, which is typically 27 and a half years or 39 years, we're front loading that depreciation expense deduction in the shorter years or the near term years so that you can maximize the amount of capital that you have to work with. So the accelerated time frame that we're normally working with when we perform a cost segregation study is typically 5, 7, or 15 years rather than that 27 and a half years or 39 years that you normally see in a commercial building.
So, Charles, is it safe to say that, as a layperson, when it comes to actually engineering a building, when you do a cost segregation study, it's basically you as an architect or an engineer or a construction specialist, you walk into the building and you identify things based on hundreds and thousands of IRS revenue rulings, tax court cases, and other, statutory categories. And you look around and you say, okay, this assembly, well, that's a decorative light. It's not normal building lighting. You determine its cost and you determine whether it qualifies for that short life depreciation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And those of us who perform cost segregation studies, really it's a mixture of specialties, which, to Brian's point, includes architects and engineers, also CPAs. We work hand in hand with the taxpayer CPAs, and we also have our own CPAs on staff as well to understand the entire tax picture, the tax strategy of the taxpayer, and make sure that whatever studies we perform are in keeping with those strategies or those needs.
And that's an excellent point. The strategies that we have to keep in mind are, if you're viewing this as an investor, you primarily have a passive interest in a fund. You're primarily interested in getting rid of, to the extent possible, the income, the taxable income in the early years of the investment. And that's what makes cost segregation so valuable. Thanks to bonus depreciation, we can even front load that depreciation so much that it completely overwhelms the income in the early years, and you end up with several years of losses to carry over, which is a great thing.
And also, don't forget about just the time value of money. By getting that depreciation expense deduction up front, that dollar's worth a lot more to you than it would be, many years down the road.
And that's generally going to be the most wonderful thing about cost segregation, is that front loading using the net present value of money. Now, sometimes cost segregation hasn't been applied, and in those circumstances, you can go back and using either amended returns for the last year or so, or if it's been longer than that, the special government form 3115, application to change accounting method, we can go back and capture the benefits from years ago. like Charles said, we could go back all the way to 1987, but because of the way these things work, most of the time, unless you're looking for a cash infusion right now from that extra deduction, we're not going to go back more than 5 or 10 years. That's usually the limit of what we're looking at.
That's absolutely right. To go back farther than that, the buildings usually, has incurred so much depreciation that the benefits of the study quickly dwindle at that point. But, sometimes there's an unexpected reason why you need to mitigate taxes in the present year, and it is on occasion possible to go back even farther. So an easy way to think about cost segregation is 3-2-1. It's just kind of a trick to help you remember what it's about. 3-2-1, that additional depreciation created by the shorter lives that we identify in cost segregation generates anywhere from $30,000 to $200,000 for every $1 million that are reviewed in a cost segregation study. And this is a wide range, but it's fairly true for your typical building. And different types of buildings potentially offer greater rewards than others. Generally speaking, the more complicated the building, the more opportunity there is. On the far right of this slide, you see a table that lists a whole bunch of buildings, as well as, in some cases, tenant improvements for certain building types. The more complex a building is, particularly with its technology, the greater the opportunity. The types of finishes that are used greatly impact the results of the study. The amount of site improvements, for instance, a warehouse that's in a Texas suburb may have an immense parking lot around it, and this can be accelerated, whereas a very similar warehouse in an urban setting may have virtually no parking lot. And so the ratio of what we're able to identify will differ in that case. The building activity also greatly affects, again, what that benefit's going to be. Other factors that affect it are whether or not it's ground up construction versus an acquisition. And then renovations or tenant improvements tend to be very, very target rich opportunities for a cost segregation study. While the slide emphasizes the difference in building types, we nonetheless look at a lot of warehouses, which you can see have the fewest number of rewards for performing a study. And that's because even in a scenario where you're looking at a warehouse, there are going to be things that we can identify and to free up this capital.
And one of the best things about Wild Orchid is that you're primarily looking at, as I understand it, multifamily garden style apartments, which are one of the best classes of property for cost segregation opportunities. And when you look at the opportunities that are presented by the recent bonus depreciation changes, where used property can get 100% bonus depreciation, it's a very well-positioned opportunity. And speaking of that, here's a slide. Charles, could you walk us through the potential cash flow increases?
Sure. So we make some assumptions in this slide. What we're looking at is typical benefits per $1 million of capitalized costs. In certain cases, such as with the tenant improvements, we have this other category called QIP property, which we're not going to delve into in any detail today, but it allows us to get bonus depreciation on interior improvements in some cases. We're making an assumption also there's a 35% tax rate and a 6% discount rate. And what we end up with here is an increased cash flow that's generated by front-loading depreciation expense deduction from the 27.5-year property or 39-year property into these categories of 5, 7, and 15. And on the, again, going to this table, which looks similar to what we saw previously, we can see what the benefit would be per $1 million of building. And this is a benefit measured in terms of that increased cash flow. So for multifamily, which is 27.5 years, that benefit, that increased cash flow per $1 million can be, sky high. Where we're able to reclassify, a phenomenal portion of the underlying property in terms of the land improvements and the connections in the kitchens and the finishes and such. And they really are, a very target-rich environment for us.
And that's one of the key points about cost segregation. We're not in there identifying the easy to spot opportunities, ovens, refrigerators, dishwashers. We're looking at things behind the walls, wiring, plumbing, furniture and fixtures that may not come to mind when you're looking at an apartment building, such as particular decorative types of millwork. And then also things outside the building, which are typically not identified upon purchase, such as parking lots, swimming pools, and all sorts of other land improvements.
Very true. And, when you're talking about an apartment complex, let's say there's an acquisition of an apartment complex and it's $1 million in capitalized costs. It wouldn't be, it would not be even remotely unheard of for us to be able to free up $100,000 in increased cash flow in that first year by front loading those depreciation expense deductions.
That's excellent. Now we're going to move on for a second to talk about bonus depreciation. And bonus depreciation, I'm sure you've heard of it. As a real estate investor of some sophistication, it's one of the biggest incentives that Congress has created in the modern era to invest in real estate. Since 9/11, they've given us bonus depreciation rates of anywhere from 30 to 100%. And the thing about bonus depreciation is that it allows us to write off historically short life, or what we call Section 1245 property, using the bonus depreciation rate and then just normal depreciation. And if that rate happens to be 100%, well, then you never get to the normal depreciation. You get to write it off all in the current year. And that also applies to land improvements. And forgive us our acronyms, but what we call the various types of Q property, which over the years have been property in certain restaurants, certain retail improvements, leasehold improvements, and now just generally they all fall under the header of qualified improvement property, which is much simpler. Charles, could you walk us through this really dense looking table a little to explain just what's going on with bonus?
Well, I'm not going to walk through this in too much detail because some of what it's capturing gets pretty esoteric. If we're speaking specifically about the impact of bonus depreciation to multifamily housing, residential real estate as we normally refer to it, the two most important things to come away with is that the bonus depreciation changed to 100% beginning for property placed in service after after 9/28 of 2017, or beginning on 9/28 of 2017. I apologize. And what Brian already mentioned previously, which is the elimination of prior rules that prevented us from applying the bonus depreciation to acquisitions of property. And so if you'll focus on, towards the middle of the slide where you have kind of a red rectangle that encompasses the middle third of the slide, that's a bit of a magical sweet spot. The original use clause that previously limited bonus depreciation only to new construction has been limited during that time frame, and we have this introduction of 100% bonus. And what that means for residential real estate is I can go out and I can buy an existing apartment complex. I can hire someone to perform a cost segregation study on that, where they'll send engineers out who will estimate the electrical, mechanical, and plumbing connections that qualify, as well as the site improvements and certain finishes and such that are in the kitchens and throughout the complex. And all those qualifying portions of the building suddenly can be written off in the current year with that 100% bonus depreciation. And again, I'm going to reiterate, that's true whether it's an acquisition or new construction. For other building types that do not include residential real estate, but include your typical commercial real estate, or what we call non-residential real estate, in those cases, they could potentially qualify for this category of qualified improvement property that Brian had previously mentioned. That's the final column on the far right. And that only applies to new interior improvements made to an existing commercial property. There's some exclusions for elevators, escalators, or anything structural in that case. But that QIP only applies to non-residential real estate, as opposed to the bonus depreciation for what we normally identify in a cost segregation study, which would apply to residential real estate.
Excellent. So, what should you as an investor take out of that? One thing is that the multifamily garden style apartment class of occupancies, that type of building, is a very good cost segregation target. And in general, multifamily housing is favorable to cost segregation. But if you happen to own other types of properties, whether by yourself or in other partnerships, perhaps a strip center, a small shopping mall, a single family residential rental, those things too can have beneficial cost segregation results. And even though you're a passive investor and you need to work with your CPA or other tax advisors to determine what's optimal for your situation, there are options from depreciation. And it's a wonderful strategy. And having said that, what are some of the other things? What else applies to property? Now, you see this term up here, Section 179 expensing. And if you're an experienced investor in residential real estate, you may be going, wait, my CPA told me I don't qualify for that. In a little known change back in 2017, Congress actually modified the rules. And so all the short life, tangible personal property that is used at residential rentals can potentially apply for Section 179 expensing. And Section 179 is a great opportunity. It allows you to immediately write off, like using bonus depreciation, the cost of certain types of property. And historically, it didn't apply to residential rentals. That was scoped out of it since, I believe, the 1970s, if not earlier. And it didn't change until 2017. And we have this wonderful complex slide here that tells us, well, if you're looking at different types of assets, this is what qualifies. And one of the key points I want to make here is that the short life tangible personal property, that 1245 as we call it, that has always qualified in commercial buildings, but not in residential up until 2018. Now, starting in 2018, that short life property in all buildings, including portable HVAC, your window unit, your room unit, those things started to qualify in commercial buildings and in residential. But don't get misled. There's this large section in the middle of the chart called qualified real property. That also applies starting in 2018, but that's only for commercial buildings. It sadly does not apply to residential rentals. And I know we look on there and we see roofs, and we all really wish that there was a rule that allowed taxpayers to immediately write off their roof improvements in the year they buy them. But unfortunately, Congress did not give us that. But there may be options to change that anyway. And one of the key points if you're a smaller investor, is that there is a limit to how much you can expense under 179. Now, 179, it's been around since the 1950s, and it's always been geared towards what we call small business expensing. And so they say, well, you can only expense currently up to $1.05 million of short life assets using 179. And if you've placed into service more than 2.62 million, well, you have to reduce the expensing limit dollar for dollar until you reach zero. And then you can't expense anything under 179. And you may ask, well, hold it. If you have bonus depreciation and it pretty much qualifies as a residential rental investor, everything that I'm looking at, why would I ever look at 179? And the reason is, if you happen to be a real estate professional, which is a technical term from the passive activity loss rules, then you probably also have an active trade or business for Section 179 purposes. And you may be able to look at currently in 2021 and say, okay, I can use bonus depreciation, it can create a loss. Now I can carry that forward, but guess what? My CPA is telling me I'm going to have a haircut on any net operating losses I carry forward, that they're going to be reduced by 20% in future years. Well, that 179 deduction, it doesn't get reduced by that. You can't use 179 to create a loss, but that unused 179 gets carried forward at 100%. So all other things being equal, 179 expensing is more valuable than a loss using bonus depreciation. And that's really something we want to get across to you. And you definitely should talk to your tax advisors about it and how you can work with that in your particular facts and circumstances to have a good tax result. Now, one thing we kind of skipped over is that cost segregation doesn't stop when you buy or construct a building. A building has a life cycle. And that life cycle starts out with the acquisition of an existing building or the construction of a new building. But then there are opportunities down the road. So Charles, can you tell us about what goes on once we move past that initial acquisition or construction event?
So, cost segregation and these tools that we're talking about are applicable throughout the entire life cycle of a building, from the point of acquisition or new construction through any modifications that are made throughout, to upkeep the building, to renovations, to demolition of portions of the building, all the way through the point of sale. There's a number of areas where cost segregation can come in and help out. The tangible property regs, which were finalized, I think the last portion was finalized in 2014, gives us basically 5 layers of opportunity to expense certain portions of what a taxpayer may spend. Those layers include materials and supplies. There's a de minimis safe harbor. There's general safe harbors for routine maintenance. There's repairs, and then there's dispositions, as well as general asset account elections. And the materials and supplies and the minimis rules, that's generally handled, by the CPA themselves. Where we get brought in is more often with the routine maintenance safe harbors, the repairs issues, as well as dispositions, which we'll cover in the following slides.
Well, and as you may remember, I was talking a few seconds ago about how, for residential rental owners, you don't get to expense roofs under Section 179. But a frequent opportunity using these repair regulations, as they're sometimes known, or the tangible property regulations, if you want to be formal about it, one of the key points is that they give us a rule to decide whether something is capitalizable improvement that has to be depreciated, or if it's a repair, and repairs can be written off immediately. And so for a roof, just think about your normal residential rental. You have plywood decking, then you have tar and shingles. And what happens if you need to replace the entire thing all the way down to the decking, Charles?
Well, we have a whole series of tests that we have to look at, actually. And again, I want to emphasize this idea that there's layers of opportunity. So what doesn't work out in one portion of the depreciation rules, we can frequently identify a way of handling it down the road. If we're talking about a roof, and roof is actually a really beautiful one in the tangible property regs. If the taxpayer is performing routine maintenance is a technical term. If they are re-roofing the building due to normal wear and tear on that building, there's a series of 3 categories of 10 tests that we can look at to identify whether or not we're able to expense the entirety of the new roof. And very frequently we can. And, generally speaking, the easiest way to look at that is if someone has owned the building for many years and now it's time to re-roof it, as long as they are not upgrading the roof in any significant way, and this is being replaced simply due to normal wear and tear, and all they're replacing is the waterproof membrane on top, perhaps tar paper underneath it, but they're not impacting the decking underneath that, then it's usually a slam dunk to be able to go ahead and expense that as a repair. If they start to move beyond that, then we really need to examine these 10 tests that I've referenced. And a few years ago, we came up with this flow chart to kind of help people understand the repairs process. How do you identify a repairs expense versus a capital improvement project? And this slide's extremely complicated, and this is a 1-hour presentation by itself in some ways. But when we look at buildings for purposes of the tangible property regulations, we look at individual building systems that are enumerated within those regs. And those include the HVAC system, the plumbing system, electrical, escalators and elevators, fire protection alarm, security, and gas distribution systems. Anything that doesn't specifically fall into one of those categories would fall into a category which is the building structure. Now, if the taxpayer is performing work on the building that's going to impact one of these building systems or the building structure, we walk our way through these 3 categories of 10 tests. And this is a scenario where you have to be able to answer no to each and every one of those 10 tests. If you answer yes to a single one of those, you have a capital event. Now, this sounds really complicated and it sounds like it'd be hard to qualify for. And when you put it on paper, it is complicated. But the reality is there's an awful lot of work that a taxpayer performs on a building that we can go ahead and expense. And it all comes down, it's mostly comes down to motivation. What's the reasoning for why the work is being performed? If the work is adapting the building to a different use, that's not going to qualify. If we're improving the building in a number of ways, and again, there's 3 tests under betterments to the unit of property or to the building. If we're improving on what was there, then you're going to have to capitalize it. And then we have this third categorization or category that's asking us, are we restoring the building to a condition in which it can continue to be used, mostly after allowing it to fall into a state of disrepair. And this is where we get into these very complicated questions about how much are we replacing it, how far ahead are we allowed to fall into a state of disrepair in the first place, because we're not allowed to rebuild something that's been allowed to fall into a state of disrepair. Anyway, it does get complicated. And like I said, this could be a whole 1-hour presentation just by itself. But at the end of the day, and to Brian's example with the roof, we end up with a scenario where very frequently we are able to expense the entirety of that new roof. Or one of the questions comes up very frequently is air handling units. Those get replaced with a certain frequency. And we are very often able to expense those as repairs as well. Though the slide that Brian has just brought up, it illustrates the building systems that I already referenced on the prior slide. And then within each of those building systems, there are what are called major components of those building systems. And one of the tests that we talk about that's on the prior slide is asking us how significantly are we affecting a major component of a building system. And these major components, they perform discrete and critical functions within a system. So if we're talking about the HVAC system, all those air handling units in aggregate are a major component. And then the question becomes, how significantly have we affected that? How many have we replaced within a given year? And typically, if we've replaced only 30 to 40% of those, and we've passed the other litany of tests that were listed on the prior page, then we can treat that as a repair and expense that. Now, it's also worth mentioning that this isn't the final stop. Just because we fail that test and we can't identify something as a repair, we cannot identify that new roof as a repair or those new air handling units as a repair. There is one final fallback, which is the dispositions of the remaining basis of the property that was there in the first place. So if we look at a roof that has been depreciating for 20 years out of the 39 years that a commercial property would normally depreciate at, if we can't expense the new roof, we could depreciate the remaining 50% of the basis of the old roof that's on that depreciation schedule. So again, layer after layer after layer of opportunities to get us to somewhat similar answers.
And that's a great stopping point for discussing the TPR. The tangible property regulations, I always like to bring them back to a simple example. As a real estate investor, you probably either currently have or have had at one point single family residences. And you want to think about something simple. Well, there's one HVAC compressor outside. Compressors are outside, right, Charles? That's what we call them. Yeah. So, because I'm not the architect or engineer, so I sometimes forget what things are called.
With residential real estate, with a garden style apartment complex, they're typically on the ground, although there's some cases where you do see them roof mounted.
Yeah. And so you think about that single family residence. You hire a handyman or someone qualified, a contractor to come and replace that. And there's only one. There's only one for the entire building because it's a single family residence. So we know it's going to be a capitalizable event. But what do we do? Well, that's a 27.5-year asset to begin with. So what we end up doing is we say, well, it's been there for 10 years because it's Florida or it's Texas, and these things just get shredded by the environment. Well, the remaining 17 years of depreciation, we get to take that all at once. We don't get to write off the replacement, but we get to write off the remaining basis, as we call it, the remaining depreciation that we still have left in that unit in the year we get rid of it. And that's, a really great approach. And that takes us to exit strategies. Because an investment like real estate, it's only, you need an exit strategy. And one of the best strategies you can have is, you get the cost segregation study, and then you want to sell it. And this slide kind of illustrates, what happens if you just sell it and you look back at the original cost segregated purchase price and use those relative values to figure out how much gain you have? Well, this shows us a pretty good cost segregation result for a residential property. You have about 10% of short life stuff. You have about 10% of 15-year land improvements, and you have about 30% allocated to the land and about 50% to the building. That's pretty typical. And if you use those original values to recapture what you've just sold, you're going to end up facing what we call recapture, depreciation recapture to be specific. And that's basically a tax rule that says, look, we gave you depreciation at ordinary income rates, that, well, let's just say the top 37% rate today. We gave that to you for all these years. Well, now you're selling it at a gain. It really didn't depreciate that much. So you're going to have to pay back those deductions at ordinary income rates instead of at capital gains rates. Well, one way that cost seg can come into play is, well, you just do another cost segregation study on the tail end of the deal. Part of the exit strategy is looking at the sales price allocation. And in either a written agreement with the new purchaser, or using if there isn't one of those, using a updated cost segregation study, you can give a more favorable allocation to the building and land. Pushes more stuff into the capital gains bucket and less, if anything, into the ordinary income recapture bucket. So that's really a great opportunity. Another great exit strategy is the like-kind exchange. And we know that the current administration has given some indication that they're going to try to cut back on like-kind exchanges, maybe limiting them to $500,000 of deferred gain each year. But if you're a smallish investor, that's still quite a bit of gain that can be deferred. And one thing that you can do is you can, instead of just doing a 1031 exchange, going into a new building and treating it like the old one where it's just building and land and deferred gain, well, you can, in appropriate circumstances, do a cost segregation allocation on all of that basis. Some of it will qualify for bonus depreciation in some cases, but generally speaking, you can still accelerate the depreciation. But that's highly dependent on your facts and circumstances. Definitely something you have to talk through with your CPA or other tax advisor to determine what the best course is for your situation.
And these rules for the 1031 exchanges, they were only finalized around this time last year. It had been an ongoing process to try to figure out what those were going to be, and they ended up being very taxpayer friendly, at least for the time being. We, again, as Brian mentioned, we have yet to see what the current administration is going to end up doing.
That's right, and it's ultimately up to Congress to determine what the law is going to be. So the administration has said they want to reduce the amount of gain deferred under 1031 because I'm sure as an investor, you've heard the stories. You just keep trading up in 1031s. You exchange from one property, it gains in value, move to another one, you keep exchanging, and then eventually, as part of your tax planning, the ultimate exit strategy, one day you die of extremely old age, and you're able to pass on that property to your heirs with no recognition of the deferred taxes because you get that basis step up. And both of those things have generally been under attack by the current administration. Well, not attack. They've been they've been identified as areas where reform can happen, and you can perhaps in the future, some of these benefits are going to be cut back. But there's more to it than exit strategies. There are all kinds of other issues that you can run into if you own other properties. And so before talking about what some of those are, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about tax credits. A deduction is a pretty simple concept. So is a tax credit. Assume you have a taxpayer with like $10 in income, 40% tax rate, and you end up paying $4 in taxes. You get somehow a $1 deduction. That reduces your taxes by 40 cents. And we show the math. That $1 deduction multiplied by the tax rate, well, that's how much you're saving through that $1 deduction. So your taxes go down from $4 to $3.60. Tax credits are great because they're generally dollar for dollar reductions. So you $4 in taxes, but you get a $1 tax credit, your taxes go down by $1 to $3. You get a dollar for dollar reduction. And that's a general rule. There are all kinds of complicated rules that can step in and limit just how much you can take in a tax credit in a given year.
And Brian, I think it's important to remind everyone that when we're talking about the cost segregation study, that's a tax deferral as opposed to a credit or a deduction.
Exactly right. Everything up until this point we've discussed has been deductions, not credits. But now, because you may own other types of property, we're going to talk about the Section 45L tax credit. And it's an energy efficiency subsidy for residential housing, all types of residential housing. It can apply to mobile homes, though we're not going to really talk about that. And because it applies to mobile home manufacturers for the most part, it also can apply to apartments and other property that is newly developed. If you develop property and then hold it out for lease or for sale, you can get this 45L deduction, which is, if you meet certain energy savings targets, is about $2,000. Well, it's not about. It is exactly $2,000 per dwelling unit. So for a single family home, $2,000, that's nice. For a 400 unit apartment building, assuming they all qualify, well, I'm not going to do the math, but that adds up really quick. And as a tax credit, it can reduce dollar for dollar your taxes. So if you're into developing and holding property for lease or sale, tract housing, apartments, then this can be a really wonderful opportunity for you. And it does apply to multifamily, but only of 3 stories above grade or fewer levels. It does not apply to mid-rise, 4 stories above grade or taller, say urban village type developments. It doesn't apply to most mixed use developments either. That has something else. And that is what we call the 179D deduction. We'll get to it in a second. And oh, wow, here's a wonderful rule of thumb. So when you're looking at your newly developed properties, you're looking for SEER ratings of 13 or higher and at least 80% AFUE furnace. Charles, what does that even mean? I mean, I'm kind of lost.
So these are very technical terms. On the engineering side, when we're talking about 45L, whether or not something qualifies or not is dependent upon what are called ASHRAE standards, which are specific engineering standards. They're not tax standards, but the tax code section allows us to fall back on these engineering standards. And so when we talk about with a SEER rating or an AFUE furnace, et cetera, these are all ways of measuring the efficiency of the heat pumps or the HVAC system or the insulation within a commercial, a residential property in this case.
And so I think it's safe to say that if you aren't familiar with these terms, your contractor will be. And so they should be able to tell you, oh yeah, it's going to have a SEER rating of 18, or the furnace is going to meet this value, the insulation has an R value of whatever. And there may already be local environmental regulatory laws in place that require you to construct buildings with a certain insulation R value. And
that's absolutely the case. And most developers are building to the local building codes. And so what we will see as far as Code Section 45L goes, the ability of properties to qualify is often dictated by the local building codes, because most developers aren't exceeding those code requirements in terms of the R value of the insulation or the SEER value of the HVAC system. But in those areas that do have the better codes, then we do have a high likelihood of being able to qualify. And Brian, I think with 45L, it's worth reiterating who is actually specifically able to qualify, because it's certainly not every owner of residential real estate.
Right, and that's a very important point. To qualify, you need to develop the property. You need to use the example of an apartment complex, you need to have land, you need to be the developer, you need to own it, you need to have tax basis in it during the development process. And then finally, you need to be the one leasing it out to the tenants, because a trigger for the credit isn't like in most cases with like depreciation. It's we're placing in service an asset in this year. That means it's ready for use. We're holding it out for rent. And that's when we can take depreciation. For the credit, though, it's when have you sold it or leased it to an end user who's going to use it as a residence? That's the credit. So you need to hold it all the way from development through leasing. And that cuts out speculative developers. It cuts out the new acquirers of new apartment complexes. So it's a very limited group of people who can claim this. But if you're into new property development, you might be able to do so.
You could, this gets down to logistics and making sure you have the right order of operations. If you have foreknowledge that you'd like to take advantage of this, then that might, change how you think about your property ownership and what you do with that property downstream, as opposed to just selling off. You develop the property, you immediately sell to someone who's going to manage it. That'll take you out of the running for it. But if you have a stake in it at the point in which it's being sold to the end user, that changes it. For those who are building entire single-family home communities, and then they're selling directly to the end users, it becomes a wonderful opportunity for them.
All right. And that takes us to the end of our little discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Charles and Brian. Appreciate that. A lot of great information. I know we covered a lot of different things. Hopefully, anyone listening got some great ideas to think about and options to consider. Our website does have a lot of additional information, including some of the slides or information in the slides from this presentation. There's also some frequently asked questions, some case studies. There's also some additional information. I know we just barely touched on the 179D energy efficiency deduction and the 45L tax credit. There's some additional information on the website as well. If there's any questions, we're happy to answer those. My contact information is there. Again, our website, everything after the @ sign and my email address, sourceadvisors.com is there. My phone number and email are there as well, so feel free to reach out. With that, Suzette, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I guess we should stop sharing the screen. There we go. All right. Well, that was very, very informative. Now, I do have a question for you. So, I recently heard, and can't really remember like pinpointing where exactly I heard this, but that eventually bonus depreciation is going to start doing a step down in process. Can you guys speak a little bit about that?
Certainly.
Sorry, I was on mute and didn't realize it. Brian, do you want to take it or do you want me to?
Sure. I'll take it. Bonus depreciation does start a step down very soon. And what year is that? Is that
2023.
next year?
Yeah.
2 years from now. Okay, good. You know, coming out of the pandemic, it's hard to remember sometimes what year it actually is now. But it does start a long step down. And if experience is any teacher, now's a great time to be buying real estate because you do get that bonus depreciation. But just because there's a stair step down, we saw that before with the PATH Act in 2016. And then 2 years later, they came back and said, okay, we're not just going to extend bonus, we're going to up it to 100%. So can't get a crystal ball out and say for sure that we're going to have bonus depreciation with a stair step down in the future. It may be that Congress wants to encourage economic investment and they continue it into the future.
And that step down, it takes a very long time. It's 20% per year beginning in 2023. So right now we have 100% bonus. In 2023, it becomes 80%. That 80% is still much higher than historical bonus depreciation. In 2024, it's at 60, et cetera, until it's eventually eliminated. So I'm not too concerned about it for the very reasons that Brian mentioned. It may very well come back.
Awesome. Well, gentlemen, that was very informative. That's like the most in-depth presentation of bonus depreciation, cost segregation I've ever sat through. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of investors very informed about what you've discussed. And, you know, I didn't even know about the developer exclusive items. So that was really helpful. Definitely going to bring you guys on again. I took a note down about perhaps bringing you back to discuss repairs versus improvements. You know, we can schedule that out in the future, but yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you all. And yeah, we'll get this up and posted and get this out to investors.
Thank you, Suzette.
Thanks, Suzette.
Thank you.
Appreciate you having us. All righty, take care.